actually about 10:20, so we probably should get started. Give you a couple extra minutes to hopefully get something to eat and drink and look around at all the materials. I don't know how quickly we have to be out of this room afterwards. I don't think too quickly because it's lunchtime, so we'll leave our materials up for a bit afterwards too, so you can come up and take a look and ask questions if you'd like. So we're going to start this section talking about accommodations for children and then accommodations for adults. A lot of the main accommodations would be put on most any IEP plan or 504 plan, and you guys are probably all familiar with a lot of those. For example, being able to take tests outside of the regular classroom, having additional time for tests, modifying assignments as needed or whatnot. But some of the things that we really focus on because of the executive functioning challenges that they have would be to have upcoming assignments ahead of time for these students, and to have more of like in college when you get a syllabus at the beginning of the semester and you know exactly what topic you're going to be talking about and you can get a hold of that information ahead of time. That priming or pre-planning is so critical to our clients with the cognitive communication impairments. And so if we can get teachers to give us a lot of the information about what's coming up and get a plan for those students to be looking at it the weekend before or the evening before, so that when they hear information on volcanoes, for example, on Tuesday morning, they've read about it over the weekend and reviewed it on Monday, so that then they're more familiar with that information, because they're more likely to process it if it's not brand new learning information. So that's that kind of pre-reading opportunities. There's a couple of great resources that I use that would be the Spark Notes and Lit Charts are two resources that can help with that pre-reading and priming for the literature that kids will engage in high school especially. And a lot of times teachers don't really like those resources because they feel it's kind of cheating, or they're not reading the book, they're just using those resources to get the details out of it. But I find that a lot of my students benefit so much from looking at what are all the characters in the book and what's the plot and what are some of the nuances of each chapter. And then I, of course, encourage them to read the book also, but then their brain is kind of primed for that information. So having that in as an accommodation can be very beneficial to those kids to have that information at their disposal ahead of time. Encouraging use of highlighters to improve their awareness and ability to sort out that relevant information and not have to bring in all of the information, but then they can just kind of focus on the highlighting. And even above that, rewriting information so that they pull the details out and rewrite it on a totally separate piece of paper without all of the irrelevant information. That we'll have those as accommodations. Time management and time management strategies such as the Ready, Do, Done. I just forgot who does that. Sarah Ward, there you go. And she's got a great website, Cognitive Connections, I think it is, that she provides a lot of her materials that you can purchase or look up. And I've gone to a couple great webinars for her. But the Ready, Do, Done is kind of that idea of them figuring out what they need to do to get ready to do a task, what it's going to entail to do that task, and what it looks like to be done with that task. That's that kind of pre-planning and then follow through, and then the metacognitive awareness part of assessing how did it go and did I meet up with what was supposed to look like when it was done. And it seems like that should just be something that kids could just naturally do, but having it as an accommodation and even written into the 504 plan helps to make sure that everyone's on target with the fact that the child needs this, and then they'll help follow through. Use of timers, a lot of times the schools don't really let kids use their cell phones in school, although some are good about that, and some are realizing that it can be a real good tool to help them stay on target with, snapping a picture of the homework assignment up in the corner of the board, or putting in a timer to remind them, that they have a test or whatever. So make use of those and putting it on as an accommodation for them. Encourage clarification strategies to decrease confusion and assure comprehension. Again, we've talked about that our kiddos often don't know that they need to clarify something. They're confused, but they just really don't know what to do about it. And so if the educators, teachers, speech language pathologists in the school and whatnot can help them by saying, it seems like that's kind of confusing to you. Can you tell me what you understand or what you understand that you're supposed to do, and then we'll figure out what pieces you're missing, and then helping them to learn how to clarify and ask for those clarification needs. I advocate quite a bit for open book note, assignment, and tests when needed. Obviously, it's not going to be across the board, but if our student has significant memory problems, then if they're taking a test the same way as their peers are, you're not testing their knowledge on that information, you're testing their lack of memory. Because they could have studied it and had it down the night before, and the next day, it's gone. They can't remember. And so I advocate for open note, open books, or having kind of some key word lists that they have to draw from, because then they're still having to find that information, and they still have to know it, but they just aren't having their memory tested when they go into a testing situation. Have information presented in a consistent and structured manner. So, for example, teachers that kind of, sometimes they write the assignment up on the board, and sometimes they just verbally say it. Sometimes you put your homework here to turn in, and sometimes they're like, oh, just toss it on my desk. These kids need consistency and structure in where they're going to find the critical information that they need. That was one reason that for some students, the Google Classroom online situation actually worked better for them, because everything was right there. They could see missing assignment when it was missing, and could see turned in when it was turned in. And so those kind of resources are helpful for them to get the consistent, structured feedback of how they're doing and whether or not they're following through with their academic needs. Simplifying multiple part assignments and questions on tests. So oftentimes teachers will have a question, there's 3 parts in there, and our kids will get 1, and then they'll move on to the next, and then they miss 2 points, or however many points each part was worth. And so talking to teachers about either highlighting, you need to answer all 3 of these parts, or actually separating them. I'm asking this, and this, and this, so that the students know what's expected of them, because they often get overwhelmed and they can't parse out the relevant information. And also accommodations for encouraging consistent use of their planners and folders and their organizational tools, because they don't necessarily recognize that they're going to be that beneficial, and so we can get them a planner, but then they leave it at home, they don't write anything in it, and they need that encouragement, and having it in the 504 or IEP plan. Then we get the teachers more on board with saying, did you write that in your planner? Where's your planner? Can you pull your planner out? And we'll make sure you have that information in there so that we can get them more structured and consistent with using it. So those are just a few of the accommodations that we would recommend for children.
And then the primary accommodations that we usually use with most of our adults includes modifying their work schedule to prevent cognitive fatigue and overstimulation. So one of the things we try and encourage is that they ease their way back into work. Instead of going from they weren't working at all to all of a sudden they're working 40 hours a week, that doesn't usually go very well, and it doesn't set them up for success. So trying to start out maybe working 2 days a week, and then once they can really build up their stamina, add another day in. Or up until part-time or full-time, whatever it is they're trying to achieve. Also trying to have a consistent work schedule to facilitate in their memory. So if they work on a Tuesday from 8 to 5 this week, and a Thursday 6 to 10 this week, but then next week they're working Wednesday, Friday, it's really hard for them to remember what their work schedule is. They might show up late, they might totally miss one of their scheduled shifts, and so trying to have more of a consistency with that can be really helpful. Also allowing the option to take breaks as needed throughout the day. With our brain injury folks, they usually tend to get fatigued around like 2 to 3 in the afternoon. And so if they're scheduled a full work day from 8 to 5, they're not even going to be able to really be able to process everything and get some of those higher level tasks done later in the day. So it's really important that they're allowed time to really decompress, take some breaks, and then be able to come back once they're a little more rested. Also, advocating the need for a distraction-free work environment, or limiting interruptions throughout the day. So I was working with a teacher who had an acquired brain injury, and one thing that she really struggled with and it would really throw her off was when she would be in the middle of a lesson teaching her kids, but then someone would come and knock on her door and interrupt her or ask a question. And she had such a hard time coming back to that lesson and remembering what she was teaching about, and it would just totally throw her off. And so trying to work with her coworkers as well, as, or the president of the school, or whoever it is that's usually interrupting, trying to have them do it maybe during lunch or some time where it's not gonna distract her. Also, being able to provide them with written instructions as opposed to verbally. So that kind of goes back to your question earlier about the processing verbal information versus visual. So this can be helpful too, especially when they're long instructions of, hey, I need you to do this, 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 and this, and when you're done with that, I need you to, come see me in my office. They might only remember the first two things they need to do. And so instead of providing them verbal instructions, have them write out the specific tasks that they are expecting, just to help the individual be able to remember more and follow through. And then with that also just goes with providing clear and frequent feedback. So the feedback can be really important of letting them know what your expectations are in a very clear manner, to not be vague with that, because oftentimes, like we mentioned, they have difficulty processing information. So if it's not very clearly written out for them, then they might not pick up on some of those social cues or things like that that they're expecting from them. And then another one is to limit the demands for participation in extracurricular activities. So oftentimes with jobs, they might also have outside expectations. You might need to volunteer, you might have meetings, you might need to do lunch duty, recess, things like that. And so letting them know that those outside expectations may be limited, or for a certain duration they might not be able to participate in them at all due to the severity of their fatigue.
One more note on that with regard to accommodations for adults, the term that is frequently used would be a reasonable accommodation. And so when you're in a work setting and you have someone that feels like they're struggling at work, then you can say, well, can you find out from your HR department or whatever, what are the reasonable accommodations that we're able to access? And they often, even the HR department is not always familiar with that with regard to the traumatic brain injury type situation. And so we've got to research that and figure out what they'll allow that they consider to be reasonable. We're kind of moving on to more specific treatments in the different areas that we target with our clients. And so we're going to start with the treatment for executive functions. And I want to point out, this is one of the slides that's from Therapy Insights, so I'm going to give them a little nod. Megan Burke started that, and they have a fabulous set of resources. If you look them up, Therapy Insights, they have PT, OT, speech, mental health, resources like this that you can purchase, webinars that they do, just all kinds of awesome stuff on there. And we've kind of developed some of our own, and then also found this, so it's like, wow, this is a great way to just be able to download it and hand it to our clients because they hit kind of all of the areas. So with regard to executive function skills, some of the big areas that we really need to look at is errorless learning. For those of you that are out in the field, you're going to know what most of these things are, and if you're in the program here and you've gotten through your CogComm class, you'll be aware of that too. But errorless learning is so critical with our clients, because when you've got these impairments and you learn something incorrectly, it's just stuck in there so hard sometimes that we really need to back up and help them to proceed when they're learning new information in a way that they avoid those error patterns. So one example that I can think of is a client of mine had to check into a gym, and there was a certain code he had to put in, and he always did the procedure incorrectly. And so then he would be stuck out there holding people up while he was trying to figure out, remember, what order did I have to put this in? And so coming up with some errorless learning strategies that we would practice it as if we had the keypad right there in therapy and say, okay, you keep messing up on step 2, so let's go back. What's step 2? Let's do step 2. several times, and now we're going to pair it with step 1 and then to step 2, and then finally we'll put it all together and go step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4, and just repeating that in a situation that's a quiet, controlled therapy setting, and then having it learned enough that they can go into that functional setting and follow through with that. We talked a lot about metacognitive strategy instruction, and we have a whole bunch of resources that you guys can access from the packet that we uploaded that we will go over with our clients. So depending on whether they've got memory challenges or attention challenges, we'll find some worksheets that help them learn about that, and in addition to treatment activities that we do. But a big part of our therapy is educating them on, what are the different types of attention, so that they are aware, oh, that's where I was taxing my divided attention. I need to find a way to back off and not have the radio on when I'm trying to cook, because I just can't divide my attention in that way. And so that metacognitive strategy instruction is helping them to better understand what their challenge areas are, so that then they know when to implement a compensatory tool or strategy. Instructional training and metacognitive awareness, direct instruction. So direct instruction is more when we're actually demonstrating to them how to do a particular activity or utilize a particular tool or strategy, and then we have them implement that. And then a lot of the instructional training and metacognitive awareness tools that we use. Did you bring the CogSmart? The CogSmart was developed by the VA, and it's like a 13 lesson 10? Oh, it used to be. They modified it. And you just go through and you can have them work through each of the exercises. It provides them educational information and then gives them some exercises to go through in order to target those different areas, and that's a great resource. Constant Therapy, I think Josilyn has her iPad up here, and she has a membership to that, so we can have that up here at the end. But Constant Therapy has from child to adult activities that they can do to target the executive functioning and high-level cognitive communication skills, and it goes from more simple to more complicated. And Lumosity is another.
Can I go back to this real quick? So Constant Therapy is a brain rehabilitation app for anyone with neurological related conditions. So like she said, children and adults. So that could be anything from learning disorders like ADHD, developmental delays. Also with our adults, that could be stroke, brain injury, dementia. So what you do is you create a account for the client, and you put in their medical information. And then you select specific skills that individual has difficulty with. So that could be memory, attention, processing information, problem solving, visual scanning. And then it will pull up a bunch of exercises based on that information that would be helpful for them. This is also great for kids too, because you can work on speech, you can work on reading, writing, phonological awareness. So this is wonderful for our aphasia clients too. So it's really a well-rounded app that I've loved using with a lot of my different clients, and it's very versatile. This will be up here if you ever want to come scan through it.
And we're trying to target most of those things that we know are evidence-based practice strategies or best practice things. So Lumosity is probably one of the most well-known of the websites that has games and activities, and I always avoid the word games and put activities in notes just for insurance purposes, but you can go in and choose specific areas such as attention, memory, processing, math, reading, whatever, and then they can go through a program. And again, the research shows that just by doing Lumosity, for example, on its own, your skills are not going to improve, but it's that combination of doing those along with therapy where you're doing the metacognitive awareness training to figure out, well, why did I struggle with this activity, but I didn't so much on this one? What's different? Or how can I decrease the distractions by turning off the sound on this game, and then I can perform better? And then how does that relate to my real life and the functional challenges that I have? So for example, there's a great one in that Lumosity that's a barista, where you get to make coffee, and it really taxes the divided attention, the working memory, the attention to detail. And so then they can say, oh gosh, in my job, I have to do these types of tasks that are very similar. How could I make some accommodations or modify what I'm doing at my job to have me improve my skill with it like I did in this activity? Some of the educational books that we use quite a bit is the Brain Injury Survival Kit. I love this one because it was written by Cheryl Sullivan, Sullivan?
Yeah, Cheryl Sullivan.
Sullivan, who was a doctor and then had a brain injury, and so she wrote the book, and it's a great resource because it goes very bullet format where you can just pick a chapter like I'm going to look at memory, and then you can look bullet format at some of the tools and strategies that she thinks might help, and then also that metacognitive awareness information, so she has a description of what that means and then go into some tools and strategies. Coping with mild traumatic brain injury is another one when they've kind of gone through the one book and then they just kind of want more of that educational information about how to cope with the mild brain injury. That's a great resource. The CEO of Self is, I think I have that one there. Yeah, this one, because it kind of breaks it up into like memory management, project management, forget what the 4 areas are. Oh, there we go. So space management, memory management, and time management. So they break up those areas and then have different activities once they've explained what it is and how it might be impacting you functionally, and then some strategies and things that they might be able to put into place. All the wall Cork books, any of you have been around for years. Steve's nodding his head, we've been doing those for years, but they have a whole range of them, and depending on what your topic is that you're trying to work on, there's memory ones, there's language, high-level language ones, word finding, very specific, and they've got lots of those workbook activities that you can do with clients. We do those with our clients, but also our treatment is very much focused on functional, like they bring stuff in, they might bring their stack of mail into us to work on organization and sorting and decision making rather than doing workbook activities that don't relate to their life as much, because most of the clients that we get, they are trying to either get back to work or they're already at work and they're needing accommodations. And so if we stick worksheets in front of them, oftentimes they're like, I don't even want to go there because my focus is on the challenge that I'm going to have at work tomorrow morning when I go back. But they're still definitely beneficial resources. So Results for Adults is a great resource that has like a picture that they look at, and then they have to do some memory, working memory, short-term memory, attention, problem solving with each one, and it's just got a variety of them, and so you can work through it to see how they're progressing. So if you give it to them over time, you can assess that they, were getting these types of scores initially, and now they're doing much better at the short term and the working memory and the deductive reasoning tasks that are at the end of it.
This is also great for safety awareness, because a lot of these issues involve like, oh, there's a fire in a kitchen. Like, just that attention to detail and the ability to recognize the safety issues. How should they problem solve that? How should they navigate that? So it targets a lot more than just
Right, and there's functional ones like taking a train or a plane or a bus somewhere, and so you have to follow the schedule, and so again, very functional. The deductive reasoning workbook is a great resource, except that there are errors all through it where they've misspelled something or they've mixed up a name that's supposed to be in it, and so we've had to sometimes our clients will point it out, but we've found a lot of them and marked them. But so if you do get that resource, I would watch for that. But it's deductive reasoning activities that are very functional. So like one of them might be you have a meeting and you need to figure out where everyone's going to sit, because this person gets distracted when they sit next to this person, so they don't want to be together, and these two want to be across from each other so that they can communicate more effectively, whatever. And you have to follow all the deductive reasoning clues throughout, and there's just a variety of them that get more complex. So it's, again, a really good way to assess over time how they're doing, because you can give them the more simple ones, and then as they progress, get up to the more difficult ones. And they're functional, because it might be planting a garden or scheduling a work day, or you've got a dinner gathering and you need to figure out what to make, and so you've got to figure out your meal planning and the ingredients that you need and whatnot. So that's a resource that we use quite a bit. The Brain Injury Rehab Workbook is another one. I really like the memory portion of that because it has visual displays that show like having a file cabinet and how, oh, no, that was the one you were holding up, that one.
They're the same.
Yeah, but both of those are good resources that they have both activities that you can do, and they also really target that instructional training and metacognitive awareness part to be able to explain it in a way that our clients can understand, you know, what's the encoding, what's the storage, and what's the retrieval part of memory so that they can figure out where their problem areas are and decide where to go from there. Because kind of our whole point is to figure out accommodations, environmental modifications, and then the compensatory tools and strategies that they're going to want to put into place. More for the kids, there's the executive skills in children and adults, and one of the resources that is in your packet is the stop and read the room, and I'm not sure how much you guys have done with that, but basically the space, the time, the objects, and the people. And so training your kids that when they are in a certain situation to stop and read the room. And that helps with some of that, the impulsivity, response inhibition, awareness, attention, so that they're safe, and getting them to be able to come into any setting and say, okay, you're in a library. What's the space? What's the time? You know, it's time when it looks like the little kids are in the library, and so I need to be quiet because they're focusing. What are the objects? I've got chairs and tables and, you know, things that I need to be aware of and attend to in my environment, and who are the people. Well, there's a librarian if I have questions, and there's the kids over there that are having their story hour, so I need to be quiet when I'm around them. So just being able to generally read the room and figure out how to respond based on that. It's a lot of that metacognitive awareness for them. Unstuck and on target. I don't have the book here because someone borrowed it and I can't figure out who, so I couldn't get it back yet. But there's also an online version. If you Google Unstuck and on target, they've got resources there, and it is a lot of work on the being concrete versus flexible. Is the problem big or small? Is it a big deal or a little deal? So it's a lot of resources, and they have games in there that you can use to help kids target kind of those cognitive flexibility issues that they have.
All right, so the treatment for goal-directed behaviors. So just to kind of dive into what exactly are goal-directed behaviors. So those are the behaviors that are oriented towards achieving a goal or task. And it requires the individual to identify a goal, plan for it, initiate it, follow through with it, and complete it. So really, whenever we have a goal, that involves several different steps. And this can be really challenging for people with brain injuries to follow through, to plan, to complete. And so helping walk them through that process. Oftentimes what that looks like is they're struggling following through. They have several unfinished projects, which can be extremely frustrating. I'm working with a family right now who they were all in a car accident and all had brain injuries. And it's caused a lot of tension between the spouses because they feel like, you know, she's not following through with her responsibilities and he's not following through with his responsibilities, and it can lead to a lot of challenges in your work, your home life, your relationships, and so really helping them come up with some supports to make that more successful. So some of the evidence-based treatment techniques that we use for goal-directed behaviors, usually if they don't have a planning system already, then we will first have them identify a planner that would be helpful for them, whether that's their phone, a calendar, a handwritten planner, and then have them implement that. So one of the planner options that we've really loved, there's several of them, but plum paper, and I included the link there too, so if you ever want to go back and look at it. But what that does is if you go to the website, you can customize your own planner. And you can create how big you want it, you can create the sections you want, the layout you want, whether you want it hourly, monthly, weekly, daily. So it's really nice to have it tailored to their specific needs. I have found that if my client just goes and buys a $5 planner from Walmart that's not tailored to their needs, they're going to be less likely to actually implement it consistently. But if they can find something that really fits what they're needing, then it's going to be a lot more successful.
Just on that note really quick, it works well for students because you can buy a 6-month version or a 12-month version so they can try it out and see if they like it. But they can actually have their classes put in, so it would say algebra, English, health PE, and that would be printed throughout the whole year so they don't have to write that information in, and then they can designate other areas like, oh, I have my National Honor Society meeting on Tuesdays, and they could have a section so that they could write that information in there, and that's very helpful for those students that otherwise they get an undated planner and they don't use it effectively because there's not those cues that are going, oh, my English is already written in there, what do I have for English?
Yeah, absolutely. Oops. So then once we've identified what advanced organization system they're going to use, we then implement weekly pre-planning sessions. So having them sit down 15, 30 minutes every week and plan out the whole week. This is extremely helpful for both children and adults. So for children, you could have them sit down, plan out their whole school week. What assignments do they have coming up? What tests do they have coming up? Actually writing those deadlines in their planner, but then taking it a step forward and say, oh, I have a history test on Friday, but when am I actually going to study for that this week? And then actually writing in the planner, you know, Tuesday night I'm going to study for this test to make sure that not only are they going to be able to take that, but they've also prepared for it ahead of time. Or for adults, scheduling out their whole work week, things like that, just to make sure that nothing's getting forgotten about and they're not going to be having to cram last minute. Another evidence-based treatment that we use is the goal, plan, do, review. So, yep, all in your resource folder. So the goal, plan, do, review, what it does is it first helps the individual identify their goal. So what task are you wanting to complete? So for example, if I filled out one of these for this presentation, I would say present on cognitive communication on, what is today, the 22nd. Then the plan, you break your goal down by the smallest steps required. So usually with every goal, there tends to be 5 to at least 10 steps for that goal. So first would, you know, for my goal would have been, okay, figure out what do I want to talk about first. Create an outline. That would be another step. Collect resources would have been another step. Create the PowerPoint. Do a run through, right? So there's so many steps required for that task itself. So you help break it down to the smallest steps achievable. And then you have the individual focus on one small step at a time. Oftentimes they get so overwhelmed by the overarching goal itself that they shut down. They want nothing to do with it, they put it off, they just get so overwhelmed and overstimulated by it. But if you break it down into those smaller, more achievable steps, then it's more manageable. You just focus on one small step at a time. The other thing, so you come up with a goal, you plan for it, and then you do it. So like we mentioned, goal-directed behaviors, that initiation can be really challenging for folks. So you not only plan for it, but you actually figure out, okay, how am I going to initiate this? What do I need to do to follow through with that first step? Because it's usually just the starting process that can be the most challenging for folks. But once they get started, then it's usually, the rest comes pretty easily. And then the review. So they review, okay, what went well? What didn't go well? What changes do I need to implement next time to make this more successful? Were there hurdles that came up, obstacles that came up that I could prevent from happening next time? So it's really good for that awareness, the planning, the problem solving, and the initiation. Another resource we use is the prioritizing to-do list, and that again is in your resource file. So again, oftentimes our clients get so overwhelmed when they have long to-do lists. They shut down, they don't initiate it, they procrastinate, and so having them organize their to-do list based on priority. So high priority, meaning these are the tasks that are urgent. They need your focus right now, your attention right now. These are things that need to be done today or tomorrow. Medium priority, these are things that need to be done in the next week or two. And then low priority, these are things that need to be done in the next month. So then again, once they've filled this all out, sometimes I'll have them even fold it or block this off so that they're forced to only focus on the most important tasks. And usually there's only 1 or 2 things on the urgent list, which then makes that more manageable. Instead of having 30 things on your to-do list, really you only have 2 things that need to be done today. So that can help a lot with their prioritizing. Using the task analysis, that's similar to the goal plan do review. You break their task down into the smallest steps possible, and then you have them just focus on one step at a time in the correct sequence. Project management profile. I think that's this one. Bring it back. So Michael and I actually use this for our presentation. So you identify your goal, and then again you break it down into the smallest steps possible. The only difference with this one is this one has due dates. So dates that you need to have each task completed by. This can be really helpful for people with deadlines and things, big projects coming up. Help them plan, break it down by all the steps, make sure they're getting the things done on time. And then also using external memory aids. So those include things like your phones, your calendars, your timers, things like that to help remind them, oh yeah, it's time for me to go, do this task or follow through with this step or call so-and-so back. The goal attainment scale. So do you want to kind of jump in? You're more familiar with that one.
So this one is evidence-based, and basically you're, again, putting the goal at the top. What is my goal? And then you determine what's going to help you establish if you're meeting your goal or you're not. So you have your 0 is going to be the expected outcome. So for example, for a student it might be, I want to have all A's and B's and nothing below A's and B's. So that could be your 0, and you could get a +1 if maybe you only have 1 B and everything else is A's, or you could get a +2 if you've got all A's. Conversely, if you have a C, you might drop down to a -1, or if you have, only B's and C's, then you're going to drop down to a -2. So you'd write in there what lets me know that I'm either meeting my goal or I'm exceeding my goal or I'm going the wrong direction and I'm not doing what I need to do, so that then they can get into that metacognitive awareness of what do I need to change then in order to get back on track and be going in the right direction with those.
And then another evidence-based approach is the predict and reflect. Now this one is really good for clients that have poor awareness or insight. So what you do is before you perform a task, you have the client predict how they think they will do on that task. And it's used on a scale system. So for example, it's 0 to 5. So 5 meaning 100% accuracy, independently, don't need any help, I had no problems, to 0, this was too difficult, I couldn't even attempt it. And then you have them perform the task, and then afterwards they come back and they reflect on how did they actually do. Let's say on the task they really actually got 60% accuracy, but they predicted they would have 100% accuracy with no problems and no help. So then you help them recognize the discrepancy between, okay, I'm overestimating how I think I'm going to do, and I'm underestimating these difficulties I'm going to have, and help them recognize that they might be overshooting at times, and how can they improve in their awareness. That can be a really helpful one. Another one is the 6-step DeBesty problem-solving approach, and this is from the CogSmart. But what this does is it breaks down a problem into the acronym DeBesty. So D, define the problem. B, brainstorm some solutions. E, evaluate each solution. So for example, you would put in a solution. Okay, is this an easy solution? Is this going to cost me a lot, either financially or time or energy? Is this likely to work? So it helps you kind of visually see all of your potential solutions, which one would be the most effective, which one would be the most appropriate, those kinds of things. And then once you've identified all your solutions, you select one of them to try, and then you evaluate. Did that work? Or do I need to go about this a different way? So this can be a really helpful one for problem solving. Am I doing this one? The sheet. Yeah. Okay, so the treatment that we use for memory. So some of the primary evidence-based treatments that we use, again, there's a lot more, but this is kind of our go-tos. is spaced retrieval. So for those of you that aren't familiar with spaced retrieval, what that does is it helps individuals recall specific information over increased intervals of time. So one example where I use this, I had a dementia client who had broken her hip, but forgot that she had broken her hip, and she would frequently try and stand up and walk without her walker. And so I used the spaced retrieval. The cue that I used is, what do you need to grab before you stand up? And she was supposed to respond, my walker. So you present that over increased intervals of time. So you start out with 15 seconds. If they get it successfully, you move into 30 seconds. If they get that successfully, you move into a minute, 2 minutes, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, an hour. And then eventually the idea is they're able to remember it within a day, within a week, within a month. So it really helps them remember specific information over longer periods of time. That can be used for very specific things too. So maybe it's they're having a hard time remembering a name or a password, or maybe it's an adult with aphasia that can't remember to tuck their chin before they swallow. So it really can be used across the board with all clients. That can be helpful, and this book kind of breaks it down too, step by step.
And there's also an app, Spaced Retrieval.
Yes, yeah. Errorless Learning, Michael kind of went into that too, but the idea with that is to help teach a new skill without any errors or trials involved. You want to set them up for success whenever they're learning something new. Another evidence-based approach is self-talk, or what you can also refer to as overt verbalization. They're kind of interchangeable. But what that idea behind that is that when an individual talks themselves out loud through their thought process, they're able to make more sense of it. It's able to improve their memory, their attention. It's also able to eliminate their, like if there's distractions going around, they're usually able to eliminate those distractions better if they're talking out loud versus if they're just quietly in their own head. So that can be a really helpful one for a lot of different situations. We also do a lot of environmental modifications to help with memory. So that can include things like using visual aids in someone's house. So for example, I have an adult male who has a really hard time with memory and remembering the sequence of steps, even simple steps like making coffee out of a Keurig machine. So we created a task analysis that has it printed out all the steps. First, grab your cup of coffee. Second, make sure there's enough water in it. Third, put the Keurig cup in it. 4, shut it. Press, the size. So we laminated it right by his coffee machine. So every morning when he goes and makes his coffee, he's able to visually see that and walk himself through the whole process. So using visual aids like that around the house, maybe you have to have things labeled if they have a really hard time with memory and remembering where things are at. Or maybe it's a pill box that's organized weekly, has the labels, the days, the times on it to help them remember the specifics of that as well. And then we also do a lot of education of what are the specific memory strategies you can implement to improve and compensate for some of these difficulties you're having. So that can be broken down into 3 categories, as you'll see on the right: external, internal, and environmental. So external memory strategies, those are things on the outside, right? External, outside, that you can implement to improve your memory. So that includes things like planners or calendars, or maybe you're using your phone for a timer, or you're using the calendar in your phone. Maybe you're using the to-do list in your phone, checklists, whiteboards, sticky notes. It's things that you're using on the outside in your environment to help with your memory. And then internal memory strategies, internal meaning inside. So those are the things you can do internally, change the way that you're thinking to improve your memory. So some examples could be coming up with an acronym. Maybe there's like a specific step or sequence you're having a hard time remembering, but if you come up with an acronym for that, that might be helpful. Or coming up with an association. So research has shown that learning something new after a brain injury is one of the most difficult things to do. So if you can associate something that you already know prior to that injury, you can associate whatever it is you're trying to learn with something that you already know, it's going to stick a lot better and it's going to make more sense. So one example, for me, that I've used personally, is we have a mailbox that's at the end of our street, like a neighborhood mailbox. And it's just always a pain to walk to. And so I always try and stop at that mailbox on my way home from work. But more often than not, I would forget, and I would pull my drive and be like, oh, and then I'd have to like reverse, and it was just a pain. And so what I did is there's a speed bump right before that mailbox that it irritates me every single time I go over it. And so I associated that speed bump with the mailbox. So every time I physically feel myself going over that speed bump, I immediately am triggered, oh, mail. So associating two things together can be helpful. Another example is if you parked your car in spot number 4. Well, you know your car has 4 tires, right? So you could associate the 4 tires on your car with the 4 number slot that you parked in. Chunking. If there's a lot of information, breaking that down into smaller chunks. So this is why our credit card numbers and our phone numbers are always chunked into smaller groups, because our brains cannot remember 12 long digits in a string. But if you break it down into smaller chunks, it's a lot easier to remember those things. Categorization. So this can be used in so many different ways, but being able to categorize and organize information with linked items, it's a lot easier for your brain to remember as opposed to just 12 random things. So maybe you're categorizing your grocery lists, right, by produce or dairy or meat. That can be a lot easier than if you just have, 12 different things randomly written on there in no order. Repetition. Obviously, the more you hear something, the more you're going to be able to remember it. Rhymes can be helpful, or mnemonics, coming up with a catchy phrase to remember something. Visualization, and then self-talk, which we talked about. Talking yourself through things out loud can help. And then environmental memory strategies. So those are things you can do in your environment, modify your environment to improve your memory. So things like having a consistent routine, eliminating distractions or clutter, keeping things visible. So maybe they just ran out of deodorant, or maybe they need to make sure they pay a bill. Well, keep those things on the table. Do not throw them away. Do not move them away where you can't see it, because if it's out of sight, it's out of mind, right? Put them on a table to remind you to carry through with that task. Remind you need to go to the grocery store to get new deodorant, or remind you need to pay this bill. Having a designated point of organization, that's also a really big one we do with our adults, is oftentimes they'll have, especially males, will have no place to keep all of their important belongings. For most of us females, we have our purses, our backpacks, or things like that. But for males, they might put their wallet here, their glasses here, their medications over there. They're just keys just randomly placed throughout the house. So when it's time to leave, they can't find all these things. So designating a point of organization, so maybe that's a cubby, maybe it's a drawer or a shelf. So the first thing they do when they come in the house, it's just easily accessible. They put all their important belongings into that place to help prevent a lot of that losing important items or misplacing things. Labeling can be helpful too. And then again, the visual aids, which we talked about a little earlier, can also help improve the memory. And then the two other ones, which we're going to go into more in depth here in a moment, is the PQRST method of reading and the KWL method of reading as well.
We'll talk a little bit about attention. So with regard to attention, a lot of it is figuring out compensatory tools and strategies to improve the situation, which isn't always necessarily improving their attention, but it's modifying things so that their attention impairments don't impact them as much. And sometimes this is really critical at the beginning because they're so overwhelmed that you can't even get to some of the other areas that are a challenge for them if they can't get past some of these attention issues. So again, we talked about the self-talk, overt verbalization with regard to memory. That's also important with regard to attention, because the more they can talk out loud through what they're doing or where their focus needs to be, then they can keep their attention focused on that. Identifying external and internal distractions so that you can eliminate those distractions. So getting rid of clutter, in the physical environment or background noise that is impacting their attention. Some of our clients will recommend that they use earplugs or have music on if that helps them to then focus on what they need to be focusing on. Wearing a hat or visor if the sun is kind of impacting them, or if that even just kind of eliminates some of the distractions around them. Put their devices on Do Not Disturb. Very common, especially with teenagers, that they're very distracted anyway by their phones. And then if they have cognitive challenges on top of that, that's a big problem for them to manage on their own. And so it needs to be either put away or put on Do Not Disturb. Consider fidget objects. We do that a lot with individuals who have a diagnosis of ADHD because we know sometimes that can help them to focus. But that can be the same for our individuals who it might be more of a traumatic brain injury situation that has caused these attentional challenges. But having some type of a fidget object, or we have this putty, what's the company name?
Oh, I can't remember.
I'll look it up, but anyway, it's just kind of a putty it's kind of like a Play-Doh-ish, but it's scented, and sometimes just being able to fidget with that a little bit kind of keeps them more focused, and then they can process better.
Or the new trendy poppets.
Oh, the poppets, yeah, those can be helpful too. Written reminders of what they need to attend to. Highlighting important information. So for some of that visual, it's really important that they learn those highlighting skills of how do I get down to the relevant information and only highlight that so that when I go back over it, then that is the information that pops out. So even with an adult, we might take one of their bills and say, highlight the amount that you need to pay, the address that it needs to go to, and the due date. And then do that with all of your bills, and then when you come back to paying them, then you don't have to reprocess everything. You can just pop right into the highlighted information. Take care of your basic needs. If they're hungry, if they're thirsty, if they're tired, they're not going to be able to focus their attention either. And so making sure that they're attending to those basic needs. Slowing down. I think when you've got impaired processing speed, just not having such a factor of speed impacting them. So being able to just say, take your time, let's get extra time for assignments or for tests so that you don't have to tax your system as much and you can keep your attention focused. And only do one thing at a time. So we know that alternating attention and dividing our attention are the two highest level attention skills that we use, and that's very challenging for so many of our clients. And so we want to work on those skills, but in the same time we want to find some of those environmental modifications that we can do to decrease the demand for them while they're learning about their impairments and learning how to compensate for them. So there's the sustained, selective, alternating, and divided attention types. And some of the activities that we do obviously are going to overlap, but we've listed some here that we would do that kind of are related to each different area. Attention process training, which was developed by Catherine Mateer and McKay Moore-Solberg, is the one evidence-based attention program that we have out there. And it looks at all of these areas and goes from a simple to a more complex levels so that you can work on those skills specifically. But a lot of what we do is more compensatory rather than restorative in nature. But that is one that is more restorative and it has evidence base behind it. The cognitive attention recall drill sets are these cards that you can get from Linguasystems that we've found to be really beneficial. They have both an attention one and a memory one, but you just basically use decks of cards and do different activities that work on the various levels of attention. And we've got that in all areas because you can pick an activity that's a selective attention or an alternating attention or divided attention task within that book, and then you can find ways to make it more complex in order to be able to assess over time how they're doing in therapy. Selective attention tasks would be like crossing off a specific letter while reading through an article. And if any of you have gotten onto Happy Neuron, that's another online program that has online activities that you can do, but you can sign up for these free packets that they send every once in a while that are drill exercises. And they've got a couple of good ones for the little kids where like they're looking at a page that's over on the table, so you could take a look at it too. But there'll be a page of bugs, and they're supposed to be selectively attending to the one that's different, and they have to cross that out across the page, or you could do letters or stories or whatever. But basically, it's selectively attending to a specific item. The Stroop effect, we've got a good game over there for little kids where basically they're chameleons on cards and they're different colors, and so there's games where they're supposed to be looking for what the word is. If it's blue, that's what they're focusing on, as opposed to what the color of the word is, which might be blue but it's written in red. That's the Stroop effect, and so there's a couple of games that work on that make them attend to specific details. Alternating attention, that's switching back and forth. We'll do that functionally with our clients where we might say, bring in your mail, and we're going to have a pile of bills that you need to pay and a pile of things that you need to read and figure out what to do with. And so we might have them start on a bill and then say switch, and then they have to switch over to the other one and then switch back. And along that process, we're working on their attentional skills, but we're also working on their metacognitive awareness and ability to implement tools and strategies by them saying, okay, wait a minute, that's too hard for me to do. I need to not switch my attention back and forth, or I need to have some sticky notes here so that if I have to leave the bills, I jot down where I was before I switch to the other task, and then jot down where I was so that I can jump back into it. So it's both trying to work on those attention skills, but also come up with compensatory tools and strategies that work. And then again, the cards task that we talked about and the trail making tasks that you can do. We have the trail making test that we can assess their ability to alternate their attention back and forth, but we can also come up with tasks where they're doing that. So going from like A to 1, B to 2, C to 3, so that they're having to alternate their visual, or you could do auditory attention. Divided attention, having a conversation while cooking, having the radio on in the background, driving and having the radio on. Those are all kind of functional divided attention tasks that we do, and we will set those up sometimes in treatment in order to focus on the divided attention. The T, which is the test of everyday attention, has both visual and auditory assessments for that are pretty complex. I was struggling with them when I was trying to try it out with my daughter the other day because I just purchased that one. But looking at both the auditory and the visual ability to divide your attention, and then figuring out if they can't do that, they maybe just need to reduce those demands so that they can be successful in their environment, and then continue to work on trying to improve their ability to divide their attention with more complex tasks. Treatment for social communication. We use the Everyday Speech app quite a bit, which just has lots of different activities for with different levels.
That one's great for kids on the spectrum too, because it really goes into social perspective taking, conversational skills, reading the room, all those kinds of things that can often be impacted.
Yeah, rigid versus complex, those kinds of things. So, and we talk about social perspective taking. Michelle Garcia Winner, everybody knows her, she's amazing, and her website has all kinds of resources on it to target those social communication skills. The stop and read the room, which I went over already. Making connected comments, that's another worksheet that we have here that I'll let you explain that one since you did that with a client of yours.
So this one is from the Everyday Speech app, and what it kind of talks about is it's similar to topic maintenance, but the idea with making connected comments is that our comments should always be connected with the comment before, right? So if somebody asks you about your work, your response should be about your work, not about some video game. So the idea is comments should always be connected, kind of like a puzzle piece. So this has been a really good visualization for some of my kids on the spectrum that I've used, of one, helping them identify the importance of making connected comments, and recognize that when we don't make connected comments, it can make the other person feel confused or frustrated, maybe feel like we're not listening or we don't care. And so it kind of goes through what it is, the importance of it, and then what I've also done is I've created puzzle pieces and I've laminated them, and then as an activity with the kid, we'll take turns having a conversation back and forth, and we'll write on the puzzle piece what it was we were talking about. And then you have to make sure, okay, do those comments match? Do they connect? Can they fit together like a puzzle piece? So that could be a great activity to work on the topic maintenance as well. And this is, again, is in all of your resource binder, your resource folders.
And again, these can really cross over. So that's working on social communication, but it can also be working on attention, memory, whatever you're focusing on. But the social communication is a pretty big piece for these clients as well. What's wrong with this picture? That's a book over there that we have. Figurative language exercises, social inferencing, the unstuck and on target that I already talked about really works on a lot of those social communication skills, recognizing how big is the problem, how small is the problem, so that their reactions fit and they don't end up impacting their social connections with people negatively. Social groups, we do some social groups in our facility, both with adults and mostly with children, but so that when they group and they can learn from other peers and you get those interactions that aren't from an adult to a child, but actually children interacting with each other, we can really work on those social communication skills more effectively. The CEO of Self that I talked about already, and then the Hidden Curriculum is a book that's over on the table that it kind of targets more the autism spectrum challenges that kids have with not having innately learned the kind of hidden curriculums that go on in our society, and it just points them out more directly. But we see that with, if you have a child who maybe had a brain injury when they were 2 and it wasn't identified, and now they're in 5th grade, they didn't have the attentional skills to pick up on the hidden curriculums like other kids did, and so they kind of need to be trained and taught those more directly. I see a lot of our adults that because of their attentional problems and maybe memory problems, they process information very differently and they miss relevant pieces of information so much that it impacts their communication, their social communication interactions, and they tend to get in more arguments with people. And they, like I had one call me the other day and she said, I messaged her and said, where are you? I had you down for an appointment. And she called me back and she was just irate. And she was like, no, I had you down for this date and I know it, it's in my calendar. I wouldn't have just written it in there if you didn't have me at that time. And A, that doesn't help our communication if she's going to start yelling at me. And B, I know I have a client that I see every week at that time, so I know I would not put her down for that time, but she was absolutely adamant, right? And so being able to use the social perspective-taking skills of how is my behavior affecting someone else, and our TBI clients, because they're already so cognitively overwhelmed, they often are only thinking about how it's affecting them, and so they end up having all kinds of problems connecting with their medical providers and their family members, and at work, losing their jobs is pretty common for them to go through multiple jobs because they just don't have these social communication skills that they're able to effectively implement.
All right, so jumping into the treatment for processing information. So this can look like a lot of different things. So this could entail difficulty following along in conversations, so difficulty processing verbal information, but also difficulty processing written information, so reading comprehension as well. So some of the compensatory tools and strategies to help someone process both verbal and written information could be things like the priming or pre-reading, which that was one of the accommodations we tried to request for schools. So maybe having access to the written content before it's discussed so that they can kind of review it. Implementing the PQRST method of reading. So this is a great one for everyone, but especially kids in this school or college students. So PQRST is an acronym. It stands for preview, question, read, summarize, and test. And it's been shown that it can help an individual not only understand what they're reading, but also recall it at a later time. So how it works, before you start reading whatever content it is, whether it's a chapter or an article, you preview it first. You give your brain some sort of foundation as to what you're going to be learning about. And then, before you start reading through it, you come up with some questions that you feel like you should be able to answer when you're done reading that content. And then you start reading through it, and the idea there is to be an active reader. So reading it out loud, highlighting important things, taking notes. And then periodically, throughout the different sections, you'll have them stop and look away from the content and summarize in their own words what they just read. That is a really important one for them to be able to simplify it in a way that makes sense for themselves, as opposed to just very academic context. And then lastly, once they've gone through all those steps, then you have them test themselves to see if they can answer the questions that they identified in the very beginning. And then the KWL is sort of similar to that. That's where you have them identify, okay, what do I already know? What do I want to know? And what did I learn? And then going back to the compensatory strategy, so implementing that PQRST method before they read and while they're reading, helping them identify the main WH question, so the who, what, when, where, why. Those are usually the relevant, the key, the important pieces of information that they tend to have a hard time identifying. So breaking it down more into the who, what, when, where, why could be helpful. Another way to have them figure out, okay, is this comment relevant or is it irrelevant, is to ask the question, does this comment have to do with the main topic of the story? If it does, then it's relevant and it should probably stay. If it doesn't, then it's just an extra detail that we don't need to spend time and energy focusing on. Another thing that might be helpful is having them cross out the irrelevant information so that they're not distracted by these things that are not important, and just focusing on the things that are highlighted. Also having them simplify content into their own words, so having them take notes. I also had a client who would get really overwhelmed when she was presented with a lot of written information. And unfortunately, especially in college, most of their assignments, the outlines for assignments are not very straightforward. It's written in paragraph forms, and she would get so overwhelmed by that. She would come into my office and say, I don't even know where to start. I'm just so overwhelmed by this assignment. I don't even know what I'm supposed to be doing. And so one thing we did with her is we'd copy the instructions into a different Word document, and then I'd have her go through and highlight in that Word document what the important pieces were, delete all the extra details that weren't important, and then create a more simplified outline that she could easily follow where there was no room for confusion. So that can be helpful as well for some of those clients, is to maybe revise and create their own versions. Again, that self-talk or overt verbalization is really good for attention, memory, and also processing information. Maybe using tactile or visual reminders as an anchor. So for example, we've been doing a Halloween scavenger hunt around our building for some of our kiddos, and they have to find Halloween objects, but in order to find them, they have to read the clues. And these clues tend to have 3 different parts to it. What are you looking for? Where am I? What do I do? Those kinds of things. So for example, I'm black, I fly all night, and I'm hiding on something with numbers. So it was a bat that was hiding on a clock. So to help them remember, the main pieces is, okay, what am I? I'm black, I fly all night, and I'm on numbers. So the who is black and fly, the where is numbers, right? So having them hold up their fingers and identify the who, what, the where kind of creates that visual anchor and that visualization that can be really helpful for kids. And then again, having them slow down, only focus on one thing at a time, and then also use multiple resources. Sometimes I'll have clients, especially in college, where they'll say, I just don't understand this assignment or this topic. It's okay, well, did you look at the meaning up in your textbook? Well, no. Okay, well, did you research it on Google? No. So it's just having them really use their resources and find different explanations, because maybe one explanation doesn't make sense to them. Can they find one that's more simplified that does? So having multiple resources as opposed to just one. And then again, some of the treatments that we do to target these processing information skills, they've got lots of them in constant therapy and Lumosity, or maybe we'll have them read through an article, or maybe have them bring something in of theirs that they're struggling understanding, and help kind of walk them through that. All right, so the treatment for emotional regulation and limited tolerance levels that we do. Again, I'd mentioned this in the beginning, but that readiness for change. Oftentimes, if we have a client that's pretty agitated and not motivated and isn't ready to make the change, then they might not be ready for treatment at that time. So helping them recognize, like, okay, are you willing to do what it takes to make some improvements and to work on some of these skills? Again, that unstuck and on target that Michael had talked about. Another one.
The Therapy Insights has a really good readiness for change worksheet if you get into those resources.
Another one that we do is the how big is my problem and how big is my reaction size. So I know at times we've probably all overreacted to certain situations, but this tends to be a lot more common and frequent with our clients with brain injuries. So what you have them do is you first, when there's a problem and they're overreacting, you have them identify, okay, well, how big is this problem? 0, no problem at all. 1, small. 2, medium. 3, big. 4, gigantic. And 5, emergency. And then it gives examples, and this is all in your resource folder, but it gives examples of what some of those problems would be. So a small problem, I didn't get my way, or my plans changed, or I'm having trouble on a task, or maybe I made a small mistake on something. And then you have them look at the reaction size scale. So this is, okay, how big was their reaction? So oftentimes what we'll see is the problem was really around a 0 or a 1, but they're responding to it as if it was a 4 or a 5. So helping them see the discrepancy between how they're responding versus the reality of this problem, and coming up with better ways and coping tools to respond to some of those smaller problems. For some of our, kids and adults, but especially our adults that tend to be a little more agitated and have emotional and behavioral outbursts, and maybe lack some awareness or insight, we will use some video modeling. So I had an adult woman who had a very severe brain injury but no awareness of it whatsoever, and really struggled with agitation and aggression. She was very aggressive at times. And so often I would record her in those moments, and then once she's calmed back down, I would show her that video of herself. And usually as she watched herself, she would be like, oh, I shouldn't have acted like that. I'm sorry, like I shouldn't have done that. But take that away, if you were ever to bring up or talk about, okay, well, sometimes, I've noticed you have difficulty, controlling your emotion. No, I don't. No, like just no awareness whatsoever. But when she can see herself in the moment, can really help them become more aware of that. The zones of regulation. So that can be great for our kiddos, helping them identify what zone are they in. Green meaning I'm in a really good zone, I'm feeling good. 5 meaning I'm about to escalate, have a temper tantrum, throw things, and come up with some appropriate coping tools to keep them in that green zone. Again, some support groups, especially for our brain injury survivors, being able to walk alongside other people that are going through similar things can be really helpful. And then we'd mentioned these earlier, some books that we recommend to a lot of our clients struggling with these emotional aspects. And then another really important thing, especially for our adults with brain injuries, is to help support them through their identity crisis, and help kind of walk them through their journey to acceptance. And then also help them identify the specific cognitive distortions that they're engaging in, and the self-deprecating behaviors, and how can they transform that into more of a positive growth mindset. So those are kind of unique ones. I'm going to dive a little more into that. So for those of you that weren't in the room in the beginning, I had shared that I had a hemorrhagic stroke the day before I was supposed to start my freshman year of college, and ended up having to take my first year of school off to undergo PT, OT, and speech. And fast forward, that's why I chose to go into this career, because my speech pathologist had a huge impact in my life. But this identity crisis was something that I really, really struggled with. And it was one of the most difficult hurdles that I had to overcome, was learning to accept this new normal of mine. I found myself constantly comparing myself to who I was before my stroke and trying to meet up to those same expectations. However, more often than not, I would fail, I would fall short, and that led to a lot of frustration and anger and even self-hate at times. It honestly wasn't until I was taking a counseling class in graduate school, which was 7 years after my stroke, where I finally started to recognize this identity crisis that I was in. I would say things like, oh, the Josilyn before this stroke could have easily finished this task in 10 minutes, so the Josilyn now should be able to do the same thing. Or the Josilyn before didn't need to study for tests, so Josilyn now doesn't need to study. Or the Josilyn before could have taken on a million things at once, so no need to slow down now. But that was not the case. Things took me a lot more time, and simple tasks were a lot more challenging for me now. And I remember asking my professor, who specializes in acquired brain injuries, is this normal? And he said, absolutely. Majority of brain injury survivors will experience some sort of identity crisis. So if this is so normal, then why aren't we talking about it more? Why didn't anybody tell me that what I was going through was normal? I honestly believe that if someone would have helped walk me through that process, I wouldn't have been so hard on myself, and it wouldn't have taken me over 7 years to reach that level of acceptance. So to fast forward now that I'm on the clinician side of things, I have been very intentional with letting my acquired brain injury clients know that this identity crisis that they are experiencing is a normal process on the road to recovery. But I also don't just stop there. I don't just let them sit there and sulk in that self-hate and those self-deprecating behaviors. I help them identify, okay, well, what are those specific self-deprecating behaviors that you're engaging in? What are these expectations you're setting up for yourself that might not be realistic? And how can we transform that into more of a positive growth mindset and more of a self-love and a self-acceptance? So some of the main cognitive distortions and self-deprecating behaviors that we see, and this can even be applied to your kids, adults, pretty much anyone, and I know we've all at times been too hard on ourselves, but these are some of the main ones that we see. So instead of saying, I can't do this, maybe transform that into, this may take me some time and effort, but that's okay. Or this is too hard. Maybe say, well, what strategies can I use to make this easier? Or instead of saying, this should be easy, or this shouldn't be that hard, maybe transform that into, you know what? My brain has been through a lot, and I need to be patient with myself. Or I messed up. You know what? Mistakes happen, and that's how I learn. Or I failed. I'm a failure. Instead saying, you know what? Plan A didn't work, but good thing there's 25 more letters in the alphabet. Or I should have done better. Maybe saying, what can I do differently next time? What strategies can I put in place to help improve and make this easier and more successful? Or instead of I give up, maybe say things like, I'm going to take a break and I'm going to try again later. Or instead of saying this isn't working, maybe say, I'm going to try going about this a different way. So there's tons of different, cognitive distortions that our clients tend to engage in, but those tend to be kind of the main ones that I would say come up pretty frequently during our sessions. And this kind of ties into the case study I want to share with you guys. So that concludes the...
Right, no, we're kind of short on time, so we'll really briefly go over the case studies. We each had a couple, but you have that information in your packet, so we'll just kind of go over the highlights of that, and then we just want to leave a little bit of time for questions.
Yeah. So this client of mine, SP, she was a 39-year-old female who had a right hemorrhagic stroke in her basal ganglia. She reported changes in her memory, attention, information processing, planning, cognitive endurance, and visual spatial skills. She was highly successful in her job prior to her stroke, but however, now she's not able to work, and she relies on her husband for a lot of those basic skills as she's unable to do them. So the standardized assessments I used for her were the FAVORS, RBANS, and ALPHA, and as you can see, She's about 1 to 3 standard deviations in almost every area, so pretty impaired across the board. So some of the treatment I did with her was a lot of that metacognitive awareness and instructional training, so educating her on the part of her brain that was impacted from her stroke and what that basal ganglia is responsible for and why she's having the problems with what she's having. Educating her on, fatigue and overstimulation, emotional ability, and what life looks like going forward. For the memory, I implemented the PQRST. We would read through a lot of articles. We read through a memory article and had her implement that. She'd bring things in that were important to her and have her read through that. Implemented a lot of the external, internal, and environmental memory strategies, and we would then use those strategies during different memory exercises, whether it was constant therapy or Lumosity, or that recall game is great for memory if you have a chance to look at that. Attention, I had her implement the PQRST method while reading through the attention strategy or chapter section from the Brain Injury Survival Kit, and then had her identify of those strategies listed which ones would be effective for her. And we practiced implementing that during several different attention exercises. For goal-directed behaviors, we used the goal plan do review to help her achieve some of her goals around the house. Very functional things that she wanted to be able to do outside the therapy room but was unable to problem solve and plan and initiate. I also used the prioritizing template and the project management profile. For planning, we got her a customized planner from the Plum paper that I mentioned earlier, and then she used that for all of her scheduling needs. She would have a weekly pre-planning session to make sure she wasn't overbooking herself, she wasn't trying to schedule too much in a given day, to help make sure she's making all of her appointments. And then we'd also do some of the deductive reasoning tasks. And then same thing with processing information. We would read through different things and have her filter out what was important and what wasn't, or use some of those in processing information strategies in constant therapy. And then lastly, I had her do a final presentation. So she presented in front of all the speech therapists. There was about eight of us. And she blew me away. She showed up with a PowerPoint, very well organized. She just spoke so fluently, and it really addressed those 4 things I was telling you earlier of what happened to her brain, what skills were impacted, what strategies she can implement to improve, and what considerations she needs to take into account going forward. So overall results, we did initial testing and pre-discharge testing. So when she first came in for immediate memory, you can see she was at 73, she improved to 103. For visual spatial, she was at 58, improved to 92. So you can see she is now within normal limits in every single area. So she made great improvements. Same thing with the alpha, 90 to 100% in those tasks. And she's become a lot more independent as a result. And she is in the process of now applying for jobs.
So I'm just going to really quickly go over mine. I picked 2 that they definitely are continuing to make progress, but it also shows the difference between sometimes children versus adults when they're still learning and they're in education that's constantly getting more difficult. JC was a 9-year-old that I was involved in a motor vehicle accident. She was hit by a car, pretty significant impairment. But as you'll see by looking at the testing, she did show some impairments in the PTBI and the TIPS a little bit, but a lot of the tests that I give her, she scores within normal limits because she's very bright, and she was bright before, and in those structured settings she does well, but she is impulsive and she doesn't think of safety things, and she's struggling with friends because she says things so impulsively and doesn't do the perspective taking to determine how she's impacting others. She's the one that yells things out in class, and so the teachers get kind of annoyed. And so she's got a lot of struggles ahead of her. I think it's going to be harder when she gets into like high school, because I think those higher level cognitive impairments will show up then, but they're not showing up with the testing that we have now. So it just shows that the testing doesn't always show it, but those impairments, often we can see them functionally. And then the adolescent, I started with him when he was in about 5th grade. He had a couple different TBIs, and again, he's made progress, but he's also struggled significantly, and you'll see by the testing that he shows a lot more impairments, 1 to 2 standard deviations below the mean on a lot of things. That's the one where the TILs that I gave him, nope, the TIPS where he was within normal limits, pretty much across the board for his visual, but all of his auditory was between 1 and 2 standard deviations below the mean. So we really try and focus on things being visual for him so that he can see them and follow through. And they're making progress, but I'm going to be seeing him for years, and we target different areas, like we get one area kind of worked on and then continuing to another area. But so it's a moving target all the time with a lot of our clients that we see, but we just kind of keep trying to facilitate their functional improvement so that they can reach whatever goals they have in mind. Thank you for attending our presentation, and we'll be around afterwards. If you have any questions, you can look at materials, but there's 1 minute technically left if anybody has any questions. We didn't print any out. They should all be online. You should be able to access the presentation and the resource packet.